Between the Pages, an evening with the Scotiabank Giller Prize shortlist authors. We are so excited to have you here with us tonight to celebrate these amazing authors. We will begin this event by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous people from the beginning. We're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. In particular, we acknowledge the Mi'kmaq and the Wulas Toji people. Tonight, after the program, Bookmark will be selling the nominees' books on the far side of the floor. Please feel free to browse and buy, and even get them signed by the author. I will now cede the floor to Andre Fenton, our moderator for this event. Andre is an award-winning African Nova Scotia writer, performer, and arts educator who has represented Halifax at 7 national spoken word festivals in Canada. He is a recipient of the Emerging Artists Recognition Award at the 2022 Creative Nova Scotia Awards and the author of 3 young adult fiction novels, Worthy of Love, which won bronze in the Coast 2018 Best of Awards, Anaka, which was the 2022 recipient of the Community and Place Award from Digitally Lit, and The Summer Between Us, which won gold in the Coast 2022 Best of Awards. Andre has facilitated writing and performance workshops at over 50 schools across Nova Scotia. He is currently screenwriting a film adaptation of his novel Anaka, which is being produced by Fine Devil Films. Andre is based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to introduce the authors of these 3 wonderful books. I'm going to start with Dionne Irving. Dionne Irving is originally from Toronto, Ontario. Her work has appeared in Story Boulevard, Lit Hub, Missouri Review, and New Delta Review, among other journals and magazines. Her first novel, Quince, came out in fall of 2021, and she currently teaches in the creative writing program in the Initiative of Race and Resilience at the University of Notre Dame, and lives in Indiana with her family and son. Her novel, The Islands follows the lives of Jamaican women, immigrants, and descendants of immigrants who have relocated all over the world to escape the ghosts of colonialism on what they call the island. Set in the United States, Jamaica, and Europe, these international stories examine the lives of an uncertain, unsettled cast of characters. In one story, a woman and her husband impulsively leave San Francisco and move to Florida with wild dreams of American reinvention, only to unearth the cracks in their marriage. In another, the only Jamaican mother at a prep school feels pressure to volunteer in the school's International Day. Meanwhile, in the third story, a travel writer finally connects with the mother who once abandoned her. Set in location and times ranging from 1950s, 60s to modern day, Dionne Irving reveals the intricacies of immigration and assimilation in this debut, establishing a new brand and unforgettable voice in Caribbean American literature. Restless, displaced, and disconnected, these characters try to ground themselves to grow where they find themselves planted in a world in which the tension between what is said and unsaid can bend the soul. Let's welcome Dionne Irving. So our second author of the evening is CS Richardson. CS Richardson's first novel, The End of the Alphabet, was an international bestseller published in 14 countries and 10 languages, and won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book. His second novel, The Emperor of Paris, was a national bestseller named a Globe and Mail Best Book of the Year and longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. An award-winning book designer, CS Richardson worked in publishing for 40 years. He is a multiple recipient of the Alcuin Award, Canada's highest honor for excellence in book design. He lives and writes in Toronto. His novel, All the Color in the World, is about Henry. Henry was born in 1916, thin as sticks, nearsighted, and obsessive doodler. Copying illustration from his boy's own magazine, left in the care of a nurturing Shakespeare-quoting grandmother, 8-year-old Henry receives as a gift his first set of coloring pencils. As he commits these colors to memory, color and the stories of the great artist take hold and becomes Henry's unique way of seeing the world. It is a passion that will both haunt and sustain him on this journey through the century, from boyhood dreams on the summer beach to the hothouse of art academia and a love cut short by tragedy, from the psychological wounds of war to redemption of unexpected love. Projected against the backdrop of iconic masterpieces, from the rich hues of the European masters to the technicolor magic of Hollywood. All the color in the world is Henry's story. Part miscellany, part memory palace, exquisitely precise with the emotional sweep of a great modern romance. Let's introduce CS Richardson. And our third author of the evening is Kevin Chong. Kevin Chong is the award-winning author of several books of fiction and nonfiction. His work has appeared in The Guardian, The Rumpus, and more. He currently lives in Vancouver and is an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. His novel is The Double Life of Benson Yu. In the Chinatown Housing Project lives 12-year-old Benny, his grandmother, and his strange neighbor Constantine, a man who believes he is a reincarnated medieval samurai. When his grandmother is hospitalized, Benny manages to survive on his own until a social worker comes snooping. With no other family, he is reluctantly taken in by Constantine, and soon an unlikely bond forms between the two. At least, that's what you, the narrator of the story, wants to write. The creator of a best-selling comic book, Yu is struggling with continuing the tale of Benny and can't help but interject from the present day, slowly revealing a darker backstory. Can you confront the demons he spent his adult life avoiding, or risk his own life and Benny's? Let's give it up for Kevin Chong. So these are the authors this evening. This is going to be wonderful. And a big thank you to Bookmark for coming out and supplying the books this evening. Yeah, let's give them a round of applause. Bookmark is on Spring Garden Road, a block away. So yeah, let's jump into some questions. So usually I'm just gonna jump into it. You know, writing a book is a story of its own. And I really want to just dig deep and ask these authors, can you tell us the story of how your book came about? What inspired you to pursue these stories, and how long did you sit with them? Let's start with Dionne.
Yeah, I wrote these stories really over a period of probably 20 years is the oldest one. And then the most recent one I wrote in the summer of 21. So 2003 is when I started the oldest story in the book. But I think in part I was really reticent to write a lot of these stories at first, and I thought that maybe nobody wanted to hear these stories about women and these stories within the stories about women existing within the larger Jamaican diaspora. And I felt like those weren't always the stories people wanted to read. And so I was really reluctant to write them, and so they really kind of came out in drips and drabs, and you know, I even told my husband the week after I sent off the final edits to the publisher, well, I've finished this book now and nobody's gonna read it. And so, you know, I mean, it was really hard to think about telling a story that felt very close, stories that felt very close to me, but also stories that I didn't know would be as engaging for other people as they were for me.
My turn?
Yeah.
First off, thank you, Andre, for doing this tonight, and thank you, people, for coming out. I'm sure you have other things to do on a chilly evening, but anyway, it's great to see you all. What became All the Color in the World started about 10 years ago. I wanted to write, I went to school for art history. I've been obsessed with art ever since, probably before that. And I wanted to write about art, but I didn't know how to write about art. I wanted to somehow weave a nonfiction story in with a fictional story. I've been quite taken with the way other authors have managed to do that. About 30 years ago, I read a book by Julian Barnes called The History of the World in 10.5 chapters. And within those 10.5 chapters, there's one chapter that is completely nonfiction. It talks about the Raft of the Medusa painting by Géricault. And that chapter has stuck with me ever since I read it. So that started the ball rolling 10 years ago. And then I'm a big fan of not telling a conventional, or telling a story unconventionally. So I searched for a long time for a way of doing that. Everything from first person to third person to second person to past tense to present tense to future tense, all kinds of mishmash. So that took me a long time to figure all that out. So it's about 10 years that I've been percolating this thing.
I sometimes just like have ideas that I jot down, and I don't even create a new file because I'm afraid that it's an act of hubris to say new novel and this is the title and then you write 12 words of it, and so I'll put it in a draft folder in my email, and then I'll let it sit for a while, and sometimes I'll try to write. And I had this idea for a boy who was sort of stuck on his own, he was left to fend for himself. I had a friend who recommended this brilliant novel called Lean on Pete by Willie Vlautin about a boy who runs away with a horse from a racetrack, and I was like, I'm gonna write my version of that, set in Chinatown. And sometimes these ideas don't really pan out because you get distracted, and I feel like at a certain point, if you don't sort of seize that idea, you lose that spark. And I think this idea for this book may have sort of fallen by the wayside. But except for the pandemic, I was stuck in the house, and I needed to as much as I love my family, I needed to find some space away from them. And so I wrote this book as a way of sort of creating that space, and it was very transporting. But then I think a lot of that sort of darkness and uncertainty was channeled through there, and this is in some ways a very dark book about people who are sort of a kid who's left to fend for himself, and about someone who's revisiting his past. Other things that happened around that time sort of filtered its way into the book as well. My grandmother, a woman who raised me to some extent, she passed away a few months before the pandemic, and so that worked itself into this book. It's kind of interesting how it sort of, your biography sometimes resurfaces. It sort of, is like this thing that you can thread through your fiction.
That's good. And Kevin, I really wanted to ask you, how did you find the process of telling a story within the story? Because we start from the point of Benson, you telling the story of Benny. Did you find it offered more creative freedom and let you explore deeper themes? I really want to hear about your creative process with that.
Oh, it's really interesting. I was just writing a straight ahead, coming of age story, no sort of tricks, and I ended up writing a book that some people find very confusing, and because it's about someone telling a story about a boy and it's kind of like him, but it's not exactly. And then there's a twist in which the two characters meet halfway through, and sometimes you have these sort of little moments when you're sort of running an errand, and you have this sort of idea for your book, because I was at an impasse with my book. I was getting towards this part where I'd plotted out all the story, and I didn't know where to take it. And then I had this sort of idea, and some of these ideas are not the best. Some of these ideas are really junky, and maybe this was maybe a junky idea, but I really seized on it. What if the boy met himself instead of his dad? And so I did that, and I had to in some way sort of justify this decision. You have these decisions, and I talked to thriller writers too, or I heard Linwood Barclay talk, and he basically comes up with some, like he was saying in one of his talks, he starts a book with this hook that's just like really, really like attention grabbing, and he sort of builds a story around it. In my case, I had this twist, and I had to in some ways justify it, and it became a story about, you know, storytelling. It became a story about like how we tell a story to suit our version, our self-conception, and how that self-conception and that story evolve. You know, like you tell a story about yourself at a certain age to build yourself up, to make yourself feel empowered, and then at a certain point, that story doesn't serve you anymore because you've grown, or you know, the thing that the story is trying to conceal has reemerged in the case of my character, and so that's what I ended up doing. I ended up sort of meditating on, you know, the dynamics of storytelling and how, you know, a writer can lose control of a story. In which case, you know, which actually happened to me as I was writing the story, and it happens to the character, the protagonist of the story I'm writing about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really believe that writing is problem solving, and kind of like every page is the puzzle piece, and yeah, that's really, really cool. I didn't realize you were kind of like shifting and building that all around the twist, but yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's like problem creating and then problem solving.
Yeah,
Right?
it's like we're creating our own problems. We're making them mess and solving them all at once. That's awesome. My next question is for Dionne. What was the biggest challenge of writing and creating fictionalized versions of a location in your book? Can you take us through that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things to me that's so interesting about fiction is the ways in which it can appear like life, but it is not life, right? It is sort of the best facsimile of life. And so for me, all of the places in the book do mean something to me personally in some way, shape, or form. And so I think that to me was a really good way to sort of get into writing those places. And oftentimes, you know, I find myself telling students that, you know, write about the place that you're from, write about home, right? Because it's going to be evocative. And especially when you're away from home, right? Thinking about how you look at home at a distance, I think is really powerful. And so for me, none of the places that I was writing about were places that I was living in when I was writing those stories. And that for me actually helped me get into those places, thinking about what some of the kind of emotional connections I had with those places are and what those places meant to me. Not so much the idea of kind of replicating it exactly, you know. I hate that thing where somebody's like, well, there's not a Baker Street, you know, and you know, I mean, because it's not about the street name per se, you know, it's about this idea of how are you capturing the feel of the place and the emotion of the place, and how do you render that fully on the page. And so for me, that was kind of the entry point into thinking about all of those different places, you know. Obviously, I didn't live in London in the 1940s, or one of my stories is set, right? But I also know what it means to grow up within a thriving immigrant community. I know, you know, what it means to live in a city, and all of those things deeply inform, you know, how I'm going to write about a place like that.
Yeah, that's really great, and that really just kind of like takes me to my next question to you. Can you talk about a couple of the stories and really give us an in-depth look on how the concept of home may have changed for your characters? And did that concept change as you wrote the stories and got to know your characters more as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, immigration is like something that, you know, an alien would be like, what is this thing, you know? This idea of sort of choosing to uproot yourself and move yourself to another place. But it also really means that you constantly kind of live in a liminal space, right? Because home is never going to be the place that you left behind. Places change and they evolve. And so that even the idea of leaving home means there's already some nostalgia associated with that, right? Home's always going to be better, you know? As I say to my husband every time we come back to Canada, isn't the food better here than it is in the US? And isn't the air sweeter? And, you know, I mean, because of that idea, right, that home has more, means more than just the physical place, that you have emotional attachments to it. But because of that, that other place that you live also maybe, even though it's your home and you're there, right, it's also this place that maybe does not feel as comfortable for you. And I think that in some ways that always means sort of being in a liminal space. And I see that, right, even with immigrants who have been 30, 40 years away from the place that they immigrated from, right? The place they come from is not home anymore because it's not the place that they left, but then that place where they are is also not home. And I think, especially as it relates to the book, thinking about some of the stories, that for me, you know, being an immigrant or thinking about those stories that are from about the children of immigrants, that it constantly means thinking about where you live in that liminality and where you find that space. And where it also creates points of both connection and disconnection. I think one of the things that's been really exciting too about the book is that I think that theme has resonated for a lot of people deeply. The second story in the collection, Shop Girl, is about a girl who's working at her parents' Caribbean grocery store in Toronto. But as I've been reading the story, I've met people from all different cultural backgrounds who tell me about working in their parents' immigrant shop, working in their parents' Dominican bodega in New York City, working in their parents' grocery in Koreatown in LA. And so that experience too of thinking about what it means to be the child of a shop owner within an immigrant community is not limited, right? It actually is a much sort of larger experience.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that that chapter in the book was so poetic and fast-paced, and I really, really loved it. I believe it was the second story in the book, and yeah, it was only a couple pages, but I just loved how you framed that and just, just put everything into it. Yeah, it was fantastic. It was fantastic. My next question is for Steve. I know a lot of aspiring historical fiction authors, and I really just want to ask, can you go into depth with the amount of research that had to take place for the creation of your novel?
Yeah. Well, some of it I had learned way back when I went to university, and it stuck. But in this case, I mean, the internet is a wonderful thing. Literally, I mean, I'm the first one to admit that if I was trying to remember a certain painting, or a certain piece of sculpture, or a certain period in history, or a certain place in history, Google. I mean, I'm shameless. I'm on Google all the time. I've been to some of the locations in the novel. I was lucky enough to go to Sicily some years ago, which inspired me to place part of the novel in Sicily. If you've ever been to Sicily, you'll know exactly what I mean. But yeah, no, I spent a lot of time on the internet. Luckily, the internet these days, in terms of research, is second to none, really. I mean, you can go to any art gallery in the world, large, small. You can find any painting you want. Granted, it's not like seeing the real thing, but it will give you a good sense of what you're looking for. You can go on Google Maps. You can go on Street View. You can wander around the streets of Taormina, Sicily, if you want a sense of the place, all that kind of stuff. So I spent a lot of time on the internet. There you go.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I guess my follow-up question to that, can you talk a bit about the balance between writing with historical accuracy and narrative creativity?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question, by the way. The thing for me, when I'm reading nonfiction or historical nonfiction, particularly historical nonfiction, I'm reading people like Jan Morris, who wrote a 3-volume history of the British Empire, which is a masterpiece. I remember reading Pierre Burton back in the day. And what those writers and writers like those people do with their nonfiction to keep it away from being dry as dust and the stuff you might read in a university textbook, is that they humanize history. They take individual characters or individual incidents, and they drill down to a human level. I still remember reading Pierre Berton's Klondike. And there's one chapter in Klondike. I mean, it's the history of the gold rush and all those things, and it's full of all the great grand characters you might think of. But the chapter that stuck with me and still sticks with me today, and I bet I read it when I was in my teens, was called The Dead Horse Trail. And that's about these men who are going over the White Pass from Skagway to the Klondike goldfields, and what they're doing and how they're trying to get their equipment over the White Pass using horses and mules and themselves. And because so many people died, it's a part of that whole story that you don't really hear too much about, but it's just so evocative. So what I tried to do, in my humble way, is whenever I'm writing about a historical event or time period, is I try to humanize it. I try to drill it down to get to, rather than giving you a blow-by-blow of the Allied invasion of Sicily, I wrote about one soldier crawling up a hill in the interior of Sicily in the heat and the dust and the bugs and all of those kinds of things. So that's how I balance historical accuracy and narrative writing.
I like that a lot, just really humanizing those moments. Yeah, that's really, really fantastic.
Thanks.
I'm going to switch for a question for the entire panel here. I'm going to quote my friend Chad Lucas, who is also an author. I seen him write on Facebook one time that the real magic of writing usually happens in the editing stage. So I want to ask, as you progress through the editing process, how did your stories change? And we'll start with Kevin.
Is this like the editing process, like with an editor, or is it just a revision?
Let's say with an editor.
With an editor, it's really great to get like a note from an editor, and it's usually like a long letter that's several pages long, and then there's sort of like margin sort of like notes. I'm just old enough to catch that analog sort of editing style where there were like you know, the manuscript courier to your house, and there was all the marks on the manuscript, and but now it's all like on track changes, and you know, a lot of the editors, it's like a real collaborative process. You know, like you have your friends who read the book, and that's really useful. And you have sometimes you can hire people to read your book, like freelance editors. But when someone has like a stake in the book itself, then you know we're really cooking. You know, it's really interesting. In my case, like the editor really asked me some really interesting questions about intentions, about moments where she saw more possibilities. I think there were a lot of sort of instances where I think like she asked me to sort of reflect on what the characters were thinking, and I think she was even prescriptive a couple of times, sort of suggesting this might be a moment for this sort of emotional beat to take place. So I found that like wonderful, you know, and editors are really great sort of like hype people, you know, like I think we were just talking about this backstage, but it's like every author needs like at least one hype person who like just sort of builds them up a little bit. And my editor, who's a really talented author as well, a YA author, she spoke with her expertise as an author, and she was a great hype person, and I really enjoyed the process of working with my editor.
Oh, I love editing. I just love the editing process. I mean, writing a first draft for me or a final draft that I will give to an editor is literally like pulling teeth. It is painful. It takes forever. It's drudge work. I find it drudgery. But once it's in an editor's hands, I mean, I'm blessed with, I mean, these guys will argue with me that I'm blessed with the best editor in the country. She's edited all my novels. And she has never once told me what to do. She's never done the whole red pencil through a paragraph or a whole page or a sentence or any of that kind of stuff. She, like Kevin says, she just asked me questions. Are you sure? Is this really what you think that character would do? Yeah, no, and I get copious notes. I mean, I work very hard to get a manuscript as clean as it can possibly be before it ever goes to her. So when she gets it and when we start working on the book itself is not going to change much. She doesn't come back to me and say, oh my God, you've written a historical epic. Could you please write a romance with a wizard or something? And, she knows the essence. She gets the essence of what I'm trying to do, but she has my best interest at heart. And she will make it the best book it can possibly be because she, A, has the experience, B, has the intuition, and she and I have worked together. We have a bit of a shorthand, but not a lot. I get copious notes. I mean, as clean as I make a manuscript, I am still edited 4 ways from Sunday. I bet I went through at least 2 more drafts with her after I had cleaned everything up and I checked every spelling and my grammar was perfect. So I love that process because she points out things to me, she asks me about stuff, and I will take every note to heart. I may not do anything about the note, but I will at least take it to heart because she wouldn't give it to me if she didn't think it was worthwhile. So I love the editing process.
Yeah, I do too. It's kind of fun to work with an editor, and I think there's a myth too that like writers sit down and then just the brilliance comes out, right? And I think that putting a book together is a much more collaborative process than people actually realize. That once you've gotten a draft in, that work with an editor is super important. And I just absolutely adored my editor. She was firm but kind, and she is a writer herself also, but she really was so good at seeing things in my stories that needed to be fleshed out or amped up, and she was so good about doing that in a way that I think made every story in the collection so much better. At some point I was visiting her in her apartment. She laid out my manuscript on the table, and she went through and she's like, write a new ending for this one, this one, this one, and this one, not ending, beginning for, she's like, the stories are good, but you're not getting to where you need to be quickly enough. And that was really good for me. Like, that's enough to sort of go back in and a note like that, like this beginning needs work, is a really good note for me because I am, a very, very meticulous reviser. But especially after you've been working on something a long time, you can't always see the forest for the trees, right? And you are so deep within the process of the work that it's hard to go, okay, like, yeah, I know where the story was going, so I didn't really think that much about, what the first 3 or 4 sentences of it were and how they weren't, maybe going in the direction I needed them to go for the story to do what it needs to do.
Yeah, and this is really great. Editors are our friends, and writing a book is such a collaborative experience, and I do a lot of writers in the school visits, so usually English teachers are like applauding when I say, yeah, your editor's your best friend, as their English teacher edits their work and kind of like, jumps into their stories. So I really, really love these answers. I do want to go back to you, Dionne. So we talked about home, the concept of home, but can you talk about how the wide range of settings help reveal different truths within your characters? Specifically, like the first short story in your collection, from the jump from San Francisco to Florida, and how that really kind of, changed the dynamic of things. I don't want to say too much, so I'm going to leave it to you. Yeah,
I mean, I love that story, and I think that it's set in Florida, and Florida is such a weird place. It's just, there's nowhere else like it, I have a friend who used to say, like, people go to Florida when they've like messed up in every other state, and like they go to Florida for like their second chance. Like, Florida's gonna fix things for them, and it never does, of course, right? But And so I think that I liked that idea. Like, that was part of one of the things that drew me to writing that story, is that I liked the idea of, like, place as kind of this search for redemption, right? And I think we think that sometimes. If I move to the right neighborhood, or I get the right job, or I switch my life in some way, right? That if I'm in a new place or space, that's going to change things for me. But the truth is, like, place is not, a magic wand, and it doesn't transform people. And so I liked that kind of idea of that magical thinking, of the ways in which, like, we'll make this marriage work if we just take it on the road. And, and so I think for me, that idea of location as really linked to our emotional state, really linked to the ways in which we see the world, are actually really, really powerful. And we forget, too, like, how much that sense of place is so embedded in our understanding. I mean, we do it almost without thinking, right? You meet somebody, and where are you from, right? Is this your hometown? Did you grow up here? How did you end up here? That's a very common question. And I find that that's something we do almost without, it's this sort of, like, tribalism, that we still have, that, we're really attached to place in this fundamental way, right? And that it says something if you're from Vancouver versus Toronto, right? And that those things somehow indicate something about our personhood, And so I'm fascinated about that connection between kind of place and people, and the ways in which place and people kind of feed off of each other.
Yeah, and you did in such a fabulous way. That very first short story, it was such a great balance of, like, some really harsh truths, some hilarious moments. I was reading it and laughing out loud, but also, like, it gets super serious about these topics. And yeah, it was amazing. My next question is for Kevin. Can you talk about the power of storytelling as a vehicle for confronting topics such as toxic masculinity and past traumas?
Oh, yeah. It's a great question. But, like, I think of toxic masculinity as like something, or masculinity is something I've had to, like, really unpack and understand. And I've only really tried to understand it, like, in the last 10 years of my life, where I just did things, in the past. And one of the things that the Giller Prize did was it pushed me to the brink. Like, the first week, I had, like, events already set, and I think 7 events over 8 days, and I had to go from Whistler to Vancouver to Ottawa and then back to Vancouver, and it was in Ottawa like 16 days. And I slept like 4 hours every day, and at a certain point I started losing things, and I missed my train stop home. And one of the things that also happens when I'm sort of pushed to the brink is, I get mad. I got this email from somebody who I felt was like pushing my buttons, and I sent them this really angry email. And I remember that was something I used to do a lot, when I was younger, and I realized that it was exhaustion speaking. It wasn't this person was pushing my buttons in some ways, but that's like a knee-jerk response. I think we're as a man, I've been in some ways trained not to cry in response to stress or talk to someone in response to stress, but I'm told to fight, to respond harshly, and almost immediately after sending my email, I just was filled with regret. And so I think a lot about how I've been shaped by these sort of expectations of what a man is, and these expectations I put up in myself. And in the case of my narrator, he's somebody who has, been a victim of abuse, and he, as a young person, couldn't admit that, and he couldn't admit that he was a victim. And so he had to kind of create this story around it, that he didn't care that his mentor was actually a good guy, and like in the backstory, he created this comic book, hero who was, supported by this mentor, and when he's confronted by his abuser at the beginning of the book, he responds again by trying to tell a story in which, his abuser is actually someone who has like a backstory that explains his weirdness, who's somebody who's actually a benevolent figure. And so I think, if you tell the story in a wrong way, and we're all creating these stories from our experiences that sort of build and support our identity, it can have a harmful, corrosive effect. But like the further we get into a story, the further we come to understand our characters as storytellers, I feel like the closer we get to a truer story, one in which we sort of acknowledge everything that happens in our experience, and we become sort of fuller people.
Yeah, I like that. The idea of telling a truer story and just unpacking all of that. That was really well put. Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm going to jump to Steve.
Scott.
I'm so sorry. Can you share with us how you approach character development? With the style of this prose, did you find certain parts difficult or certain parts freeing? And how do you compare the development of this novel, of All the Colors in the World, with your previous two books?
Oh boy. Okay, there's a lot there. The character development. I started with one notion of what my protagonist, what he was going to be like. And that was that he was slight of build, he was an introvert, he was shy, he was withdrawn, he'd suffered some childhood trauma, and that would somehow inform his whole story. I didn't know at that point what the story would be. I didn't know how it was going to inform his story, but that was the starting point. I had my protagonist at a certain period of time, and he was this shy, introverted kid. And everything flowed out from everything, including the cast of characters he was going to be involved with and his life story. But it started with one notion. And I just stuck to that, and I was comfortable writing about that, and I felt that it had a lot of potential. So that's the character thing. What was the next part?
So the next part was, were certain parts difficult, or did you find certain parts freeing?
Well, writing about Henry is my protagonist. Writing about Henry I found fairly easy to do because I had that notion initially, and I stuck to it slavishly. I didn't get halfway through the novel and then suddenly decide, no, Henry, he's going to be an extrovert, or he's going to become a bodybuilder or something. So I found writing about Henry easy. One of the things I set for myself when I was writing the novel was that each section and each part that I wrote was going to be no more than a page long. Which forced me to be succinct, to don't overwrite, to get rid of the adjectives, all those other kinds of things. So that's how I sort of went about the task. And there was one more part.
Yeah, so the last part was, how would you compare the development of All the Color in the World with your previous two novels?
Wow. Well, the previous two novels were generally, with all three novels, I write the beginning, I write the end, and then it takes me 10 years to write the middle. And with the first two novels, I had a basic architecture for the novel going in. I knew in broad strokes how the books were going to evolve and how they were going to be structured. With All the Color in the World, because I was trying to find a different way of telling a story, It took me forever to find that way. So I wrote, in effect, the fiction part of the novel as more or less linear. Henry starts out, he's a tender age of 5, he ends up as he ends up. And at that point, I wanted to weave in the nonfiction, the things that would inform Henry's life. And Henry, for those who haven't read the book or might be interested in reading it, the novel is structured in such a way that there's fiction and nonfiction. And the nonfiction is meant to be Henry's notes to himself about the things he knows, the things he learns, the things that he keeps with him. He keeps those in an old art history textbook. Hence the notion of a pillow book or a memory book or a commonplace book. So I had the linear story written out. I then went back and I literally chopped up the linear story and inserted nonfiction to explain certain instances in Henry's life. There's a section in the book where Henry grows up in Toronto in the 1920s and 30s, and he grows up in a neighborhood called Sunnyside. And Sunnyside, to this day, it's a stretch of beach along Lake Ontario, and the Sunnyside Bathing Pavilion, which was built in 1922, is still there. And it's still a bathing pavilion, and there's a pool. Henry spends a lot of his boyhood at the Sunnyside Bathing Pavilion. So while I'm writing about Henry on the beach and Henry being a boy, I inserted a section of nonfiction about how the Sunnyside Bathing Pavilion came to be, because it was something that I thought Henry would keep a note for himself, because it influenced his life, or it influenced his boyhood, or it conjured up a positive memory for him, and he would put it in his memory palace.
It's really thoughtful. It's really good. I was reading through your novel and just I really wanted to jump into the development stage tonight, so that's why most of my questions have been digging deep into that. But yeah, that's really great of just mixing the fiction with the nonfiction and the events leading up and really just kind of laying the groundwork of that character. That was very, very fluidly done, and just yeah, congratulations. That's awesome. I'm just gonna check the time. So we have about 13 minutes left, so I'm thinking maybe we should open to the audience for some Q&A if folks have any questions that they want to ask these three wonderful authors up here. Yeah, we got somebody down here.
I've got a mic here.
Just make sure to use the mic so the people watching on the live stream can hear us loud and clear.
I was just curious about the first, Dionne, the first comment that you made about some of your stories being 20 years old. And I'm curious how you approached them, how you felt about them over that time. Did you look at them 5 years and 10 years in, or did you wait 20 years? And what was that experience like?
The one that's the oldest in the collection is called Weaving, and it's a story about a boxer. When I started writing that story, it was not about him at all. I started off writing a story about an ER doctor, and he was one of the patients that she was seeing on her rounds. And he kept talking, and he wouldn't shut up. And the story about the doctor sort of progressively got more and more boring as I went through 5, 6, 7, 8 drafts of it. And finally, my mentor read the draft, and she was like, I think you're trying to write about this boxer and not the doctor in the hospital. So that was like 6 or 7 years in. And then I just kept working on it, and I couldn't get it right. And so I would put it away for a couple of years, then I would come back and work on it some more, and then I would put it away, and I would come back and work on it some more. And even when I was getting ready to send the collection out to Sal, I remember my husband said to me, why are you including that story? It's not good. Like you're beating a dead horse. It's not a great story. Like, and I was like, no. I'm gonna put it in. And then strangely enough, when I started taking meetings with editors, that was the story they wanted to talk about. And my husband was like, that story, really? And then I worked on it actually some more with my editor. And so, you know, it was a long process. And I think that character was just so interesting to me, and I couldn't kind of get him out of my head. And so I kept coming back to him, even though I just couldn't quite get it right for a very, very, very long time. I will also say, too, I think that another writer I heard say this recently, and I think it's such a true thing, that he was talking about a story he was trying to write over a long period of time, and he said, I just wasn't like at a place in my life yet where I could write that story. And I think there's something really true about that, you know, that as we get older and live more life, that there's things that we bring to the work that also inform how we're going to handle it. And I think that that's very true. And so maybe I wasn't ready to write that story when I started writing it in my 20s, and then I was.
That's so true, and I really like that story in there. It's so true about writers. Sometimes writers have to live life before we can, you know, get the tools to write these ideas that we have. It's such a weird thing to experience, but there's so much truth in that. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Over here, down here.
I just wanted to ask about sort of the Giller side of things. Like, what was it like to find out that you were on the long list and then on the short list? Did you know that you had been submitted? Was it a surprise? A couple of years ago, I talked to an author who was on the long list, and she said she didn't even know she had been submitted. She was cutting up carrots for lunch when she found out, and so she was beside herself. And so I always loved that sort of perspective of kind of being surprised. And then also, obviously, we've been several weeks now since the long list was. How have things changed for you with the attention, or like with your internal feelings about your writing or the book, and all of those experiences?
Wow.
Okay, yeah, sure. I did not think I'd be on the long list, and so I knew that was the Giller Day, and I didn't even check my email. It's like 7 in the morning in Vancouver when it's announced, or 6:30, and so I just woken up and I was looking on my phone on Twitter to see who had been nominated for the Giller, and I saw the cover of my book on it, and it was very surreal. I woke my wife up. I was really excited, and then the shortlist announcement, you know you have a chance of being on it, and they have this sort of live stream, and I remember, like, you know, it was like really early in the morning, 7:30 at this time, and I had to like make my daughter's lunch though, and they were doing this announcement. Remember the announcement? They had all these like speeches from like execs and sponsors, and they're just get to it, and then it was like, it was alphabetical, and I thought, like, my last name starts with a C, so I thought it would get to me quickly, but no, it was like Bernstein and Catton. It must have been torture for you, Scott, but so that was great. I just let out a yelp when that happened. It was really, really exciting. In both cases, my editor knew in advance and didn't tell me, and I'm not holding against her that much. But they had to sign NDAs, I think, from what I'm told, and it's been a great experience. It's so exciting to meet these authors, these wonderful authors, and to be in front of these wonderful audiences like tonight. It's really like being, winning the lottery. It's really wonderful just even getting to the shortlist. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, I didn't know I was being submitted at all. I'm blessed and cursed to be published by a very large publishing house who publish a lot of fiction and a lot of Canadian fiction. So the chances of little old me getting submitted along with all the other, there's certain limit, publishers have limits, they can't submit everything. So I had hoped that I would be submitted, but I didn't know. The long list. I'm a baseball fan, and as such, I am superstitious. So I could not watch. There was no way. There was no way. So I went and got my hair cut. My wife watched. She was at home. She was watching. I come home from the haircut, pretty much convinced, no, I'm not going to make the long list. Look at all the great books that have been published this year. My wife is literally bouncing off them. She's doing this. So, yes, so I make the long list. I'm shocked, completely shattered. I couldn't believe it. With the shortlist announcement, she insisted I had to watch. So we're sitting there at the kitchen table, and it's the speeches, and it's the this, and it's the that, and everything like that. And my skin is crawling. I cannot sit through this. So finally they announce, and of course I'm the last one. And I collapsed on the kitchen table. I was completely dumbfounded. To be in such great company, to be like long list, short list, those are fantastic authors and fantastic books. I've been lucky enough to read a lot of them, and every time I read one, I go, what the hell am I doing here? It is life-affirming. It is, you try your best, you work your hardest, and you want to create something of literary worth. You want something that somebody will accept critically. Sales are great, all those other kinds of things are great, but that's why I do what I do, is because I'm just trying to create something that might be worthy. So to have people without any vested interest say, you know what, you're not bad, you're okay, it's all right, is more than I could ever hope for. It is thrilling. I'm having the time of my life, and if I don't care what happens on the 13th. I don't, because every book is deserving. Every book is different, number one. I don't know how the judges pick. I really don't. So just to be in that company I'm fine. I'm just fine.
Yeah, I would agree that the books are just absolutely phenomenal. I really am blown away by the other authors. My press is an independent press. I did not think that I would be nominated for it. I was teaching the morning of the long list announcement, and so I didn't watch it at all. I came out of class and I looked at Instagram, and I was like, why do I have all these new followers on Instagram? So that's how I found out that I was on the long list. And so it was a huge, amazing surprise, and I did not think at all that I would ever make the short list. I saw the other books that were on the long list, and they were all phenomenal, and I was like, absolutely not my little stories. So it, like Scott said, incredibly affirming, but also, for me, really kind of magical in terms of thinking about the fact that stories from my community matter and are important. And for me, that has been, for me sending a book off and saying nobody wants to read this, and then to being on the Giller shortlist is absolutely phenomenal. Also, I live in the US, and to have affirmation in my home country means more to me than probably anything else. I have a doctor in South Bend, Indiana, who's Canadian also, and I was telling her about it, and she jumped up out of her chair and was like, "That's amazing!" And it was just it means something really, really different for me to sort of live away from the place that is my home, and to still get that affirmation from home is extremely powerful and magical for me.
That's wonderful. And that probably just about wraps us up. It's just about 7:30, and I just want to say a big thank you to the Halifax Public Libraries, to the Scotiabank Giller Awards, to Bookmark, and to our wonderful authors this evening, Dionne Irving, Scott Richardson, and Kevin Chong. If we can give them a round of applause, that would be amazing. Thanks, everybody. Let's go buy some books.